Good evening from Baghdad. One of the world's oldest cities has become one of the world's newest power centers. As soon as major hostilities broke out between the two oil producers Iraq and Iran, we came here to Baghdad to watch OPEC war. To look in particular at a regime seeking supremacy in the Gulf and its remarkable president Saddam Hussein, one of the least known but most effective rulers in the Middle East. As the conflict between this country and Iran got underway earlier this year, it was Saddam Hussein who declared, "Whoever climbs over our fence, we shall climb on his roof."
On the morning of the 22nd of September 1980, the Iraqi Air Force bombed airfields and military targets in neighboring Iran. Merely hours later, 200,000 men in 6 divisions crossed the border in the belief that a swift victory would be on the way. Little did they know, but it was just the beginning of an 8-year-long conflict that would see hundreds and thousands of casualties. When Iraq gained its independence from Britain, long-standing territorial disputes reignited again with Iran. The Shatt al-Arab waterway plays a vital role in maritime shipping for both nations. Conflicting territorial claims and disputes over navigation rights were among the main factors for the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1969, Iran abrogated the treaty over Shatt al-Arab, which meant that it would stop paying tolls for the use of the waterway, a direct response to Iraq's territorial claims over the river. Since neither side was willing to back down but not yet committed to a full-scale conflict, proxy wars in each country's respective territories were fought. Iran financed the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War in the Northern Territory that would see a total of 20,000 casualties. Iraq, on the other side, supported the ongoing separatism in Kazakhstan, with way less success. From April 1974, both parties would exchange artillery fire along the disputed river, and an Iranian incursion into enemy territory would be no match for the Iranian Air Force. The 1975 Algiers Accords cemented Iran in its leading position, but only in exchange for a Kurdish downfall. The 1979 revolution in Iran overthrew not only the royal dynasty, but also shifted the paradigms in the world. The newly Islamic Republic and its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, were strict anti-American and held 50 US embassy workers hostage. The theocratic government almost immediately began to purge the military and suppress the opposition. Over 12,000 army officers were forced into early retirement. Specialists and aviators were executed, expelled or imprisoned. The desertion rate had reached 60% and left the once mighty Iranian army in a weakened state, but it will never recover from. But in their eyes, it was just the beginning. The supporters that called for an all-out revolution in the whole Islamic world inspired a dangerous amount of radicals. Islamist insurgencies rose up in Saudi Arabia, in Syria and Lebanon. As Iran was in chaos, Saddam mobilized his army and was about to take advantage of a weakened enemy, or so he thought, because nothing rallies more people to a common cause than an enemy. The aim was to take control of the waterway along the oil-rich Kazakhstan province and to rally all enemies of the regime. The war can be separated into 3 main theaters. On the northern front, the Iraqis built strong defense positions to protect their own oil industry in the Kurdish autonomy zone. The prediction was that Iran would eventually reconnect with its Kurdish allies to seize the northern oil fields, which would be correct. On the central front, the army advanced until Desful to block a potential counteroffensive and cover the advance of the forces into the south. This would also be the location of the greatest tank battle in the war, where 350 tanks from both sides would hunt each other down. In the end, Iranian misplanning resulted in a decisive defeat. For more than a year, the central front withstood any offensive. The bulk of the army advanced into the south with the goal of liberating Kazakhstan and laying siege to Khorramshahr and Abadan. Even though the Iranians were outnumbered, they made up for it with heavy fortifications, trenches and kill zones, which took the Iraqis days to overcome. After a week, they finally stood at the city gates of Khorramshahr. 5 weeks of intense urban combat eventually made the Iranians retreat towards friendly lines, and Iraq gained a tactical victory, but only on paper. Despite being outnumbered, the garrison took the momentum out of the offensive and overthrew Iraqi invasion plans, but also gave the Iranians enough time to prepare Abadan. The fighting was so fierce that the city would be given the nickname Kunin Shah, or the City of Blood, because it was a small-scale Stalingrad. On both sides, about 7,000 men died, and the city was down to a few buildings. However, another Stalingrad just laid a few kilometers down the river, Abadan, and its precious oil refinery. Abadan was never fully encircled and could be supplied by air and sea. For almost 10 months, the Iraqis forced their way into the city at the cost of another 4,000 casualties. and hundreds of armored vehicles. The attrition was so devastating that the first Iranian counteroffensive, Operation Sameh al-Ameh, on the 22nd of September 1981, expelled the Iraqis indefinitely from the city of Abadan. 1 year later, Iran launched Operation Bait al-Muqaddas, which aimed at the liberation of Kazakhstan. About 65,000 Iranians sent the Iraqi army straight back home. Khorramshahr, the city where it all started, was the last Iraqi stronghold on Iranian soil. About 40,000 Iraqis were either killed or captured, together with about 700 tanks and APCs. But Iran had to pay a high price for the victory. For the liberation of its territory, about 60,000 men were sacrificed. And when I say sacrificed, I really mean it that way. Human wave assaults would be a new common occurrence. Countless child soldiers were sent ahead to clear minefields. Casualty rates of up to 90% were no rarity. The liberation sent a shockwave through Iraq. The army was demoralized and several generals were executed. Iraq's navy was destroyed, the air force lost air superiority, and the army has been depleted. The country will lack the power to go on any major offensive for years. Furthermore, Iraq was now in the defense. For the first time in 2 years, a ceasefire was on the table, but destiny had different plans for both nations. Iran would not step down until Iraq would be an Islamist republic. Iraq prepared an advanced defense in-depth trench system along its border that grinded down human waves. It also would receive new international credits, arms deliveries, and intel. Saddam also set the stage for an all-out war and general conscription. Also, for the first time in this war, chemical weapons would see the battlefield. Apparently this story happened in 1982 in one of his meetings. Saddam ran out of ideas, and so he asked in the cabinet about options. His Minister of Health suggested that Saddam could step down temporarily and let someone else negotiate a ceasefire with Iran, and return once it is in place. Annoyed, Saddam asked if anyone else in the cabinet agreed with the idea. When there was no support, he escorted the minister to the next room, shut the door, and executed him. He then returned to the room and continued with his meeting. Iran, on the other hand, had to cannibalize its American and British-made hardware for spare parts, since the US sanctions made it quite difficult, but not impossible, to import new equipment. Morale, however, was still high among the population. Operation Ramadan was the first Iranian offensive into enemy territory. Its main objective was to capture the city of Basra. About 150,000 Iranians and 100,000 Iraqis would take part in the largest land battle since World War II. 3 weeks and 20,000 casualties later, and Iran could now call itself the proud owner of 50 square kilometers of sand. This was just the beginning in a long list of disastrous campaigns. At least in the north, disputed territory could be reclaimed and some territorial gains could be made throughout 1982. Assaults were going on in the central sector with minimal Iranian gains. In 1984, Iran opened a new front in the north of Iraq. Together with the Kurdish insurgents, Iran staged a guerrilla campaign that threatened the oil fields close to Kirkuk. Until the end of the war, the insurgency in the mountainous region would cause chaos in Iraq's defense. In the center, Operation Khyber was the attempt to cut off the highway from Basra to Baghdad by an assault through the marshlands. Another 40,000 casualties later, and Iran was the proud owner of Majnoon Island, an economic hub that holds Iraq's Gulf pipelines. Even though the marshes absorbed explosions, the Iranians were sitting ducks for helicopters and mustard gas. This year also saw the beginning of the tanker wars and wars of the cities. In order to cripple each other's economy, which was heavily reliant on oil and LNG exports, tankers were hunted down, either with aircraft or patrol boats. However, the offensive did little damage to the Persian Gulf state economies, and Iran simply moved its shipping port from Kark Island to Ladak Island in the Strait of Hormuz. The War of the Cities was a strategic bombing campaign launched by Iraq with limited retaliation efforts by Iran. At first, it would be a costly war for air superiority, but later, a literal Scud missile duel would haunt the cities. 1985 saw action once again around the Majnoon oil field and the Baghdad-Basra highway, which was finally captured by Iran. Iraq's counterstrike consisted of flooding Iranian trenches with special water pipes as well as chemical weapons, which forced Iranians to leave their positions. On the night of the 10th February 1986, the Iranians launched Operation Dawn 8, in which 30,000 men crossed the Al-Shatab River and overwhelmed the garrison, something that the Iraqis believed would never happen. After just 24 hours, the operation was completed, with little fighting, since badly trained conscripts were guarding the city. Counteroffensives were bogged down and Iran remained the ruler of the peninsula for now. Saddam's response was to take the border city of Medan and to advance deep into Iranian territory, which was successful, until the spearhead ran into an AH-1 Cobra ambush. The counteroffensive was so powerful that the Iraqi army lost 9,000 men and 200 tanks and APCs, while getting away with just 700 KIAs on their side. The last 2 years of the war saw repeated Iranian offensives on all fronts, with the same results: little gains for massive losses. Slowly but surely, Iran ran out of steam. During another Basra assault, Iran deployed about 200,000 men, from which 60,000 would bite the dust. For nothing. In the 8th year of the war, the Iranian population lost morale. Recruitment dropped and equipment losses cancelled any new offensive. Iraq was suffering from crippling debt, no qualified personnel, and depriving war economy, since most Iraqis were incorporated into the army or other war efforts. The final blow for Iran was the new offensive in Al-Faw, in which a renewed and highly trained Iraqi army fought the worn-down militias with barely any casualties. In just 2 days, the peninsula changed owner. The US also involved itself in the battle. An Iranian mine damaged an American ship. As a retaliation, countless oil platforms and cruisers were set ablaze. Faced with the odds of fighting the Americans, a crippled economy, low morale, a new full-scale invasion, and even more chemical weapons, the Iranians finally gave in and accepted UN Resolution 598. The 1975 status quo would take place. The fighting eventually ceased and peace was about to return to the Arabic world. But not before Saddam settled an outstanding problem. The Anfal campaign was aimed at driving out Kurdish resistance, but ended in a genocide. Anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 people were killed by gas or shot. Survivors fled or were incarcerated in detention camps without permission to return to their homes after the war. Even today, this event barely gained any international attention. The 8-year-long conflict had seen somewhere up to 1 million casualties on the Iranian side and up to 600,000 for Iraq. In the end, both gained next to nothing from the conflict. The undisputed winner still remains the salesman. From a military standpoint, it's quite interesting to compare these opposing nations. On one side, there's Iraq with just 14.5 million people on an area of 400,000 square kilometers. Iran on the other side had a total population of 46 million people and 1.7 million square kilometers, which is about 4 times the available resources in 1980, yet both performed totally different. Iraq was a secular dictatorship that was everybody's favorite darling. From credits to weapons, intel and know-how, everything was granted. One thing that definitely shouldn't go unmentioned is the chemical weapons program, supported and delivered by 12 countries. Your number one go-to expert for gas was also present on the party. You know who I'm talking about. Of course, Germany. The Geneva Protocol banned chemical strikes, but in practice, the United States supported the Iraqi army in their use. Without a doubt, they caused chaos among enemy lines and played a major role in the conflict.
It was a very important year. 1982 was the year in which Ronald Reagan dropped Iraq from the list of states supporting terrorism so that the U.S. could start providing him with extensive aid, including military aid, including means to develop biological and chemical weapons and missiles and weapons of and nuclear weapons. He was dropped from, and Donald Rumsfeld, shortly after, went to firm up the agreement.
It's kind of ironic to supply your friends with a chemical weapons program and military targets, only to justify your invasion based on it decades later. One thing that couldn't be bought was morale among the Iraqi army. While high at first, most units lost faith in their leadership. Conscription and lack of training until the later stages of war caused poor communication between the branches and the inability to use and fix hardware properly. By the end of the war, Iraq had a standing army of around 1 million men, which would rank at the number 4, while Iran just made it to 600,000. Iran on the other side once had the 5th largest army in the world. Its mighty military was trained and supplied by American and British advisors. Pilots and planes would repeatedly outperform their Iraqi counterparts, which is definitely a testament to their abilities and equipment. In multiple cases, the Cobra pilots covered retreats of their own or destroyed countless enemy vehicles. However, as the sanctions came in and the war progressed, American hardware couldn't be replaced so easily. Other suppliers from China, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia and some even say Israel filled the gap. A bunch of them also made business with Iraq as well. The conflict was every arms dealer's wet dream. Two oil-rich nations, full of cash, but were barely industrialized. True to the proverb, necessity is the mother of all inventions. Iran built its own military-industrial complex. It reverse-engineered some tech, built its own Scud missiles, and produced small firearms, which was just enough to sustain the conflict, but not to supply large-scale invasions. What they lacked in equipment, they made up for it in morale and manpower. The theocratic state created a cult around the war and martyrdom, that carried the war until the end. Everyone that died for his country would go straight to paradise. Brainwashed child soldiers from poor families were used to clear minefields and as human shields. Just like human wave attacks, those tactics were only sustainable through a great population pool. Only when Iranians became fatigued, the ceasefire was eventually accepted. The economic loss at that time was believed to exceed 500 billion for each country. In addition, economic development stalled and all exports were disrupted. Just for comparison, the total oil revenue for both countries, Iran from 1919 to 1988 and Iraq from 1941 to 1988, amounted to $418.5 billion. Iraq in particular financed its war effort with credits, but was barely able to repay the debt. While the dictators and creditors from other nations strongly opposed the expansion of violent Islamic revolutions, they were not so keen on debt forgiveness. To top it all, Kuwait and the UAE were exceeding their OPEC quotas, which led to an overall price decrease that killed the Iraqi budget. Instead of $18 per barrel, $10 per barrel was the overall price, a deficit of $7 billion for Iraq. Revenues struggled to cover the basic costs, let alone repair damaged infrastructure. Demobilization and unemployment on top caused a climate of dissatisfaction, which is not optimal for a dictator, especially if you want to remain one.
March, April 1991, Shiite uprising in the south. Probably would have overthrown it. There were rebelling Iraqi generals. Good chance he would have been overthrown. Well, the Bush administration determined that they would essentially permit Saddam to crush it.
Iran's new theocratic regime prevails today, despite international isolation. The regime never really let go of the idea of expanding Islamic Shia revolution into other nations, which also brought it into conflict with other Gulf states. Ayatollah Khomeini declared all monarchies to be illegitimate and an un-Islamic form of government. The nuclear power program is just the cherry on top. Currently, the regime is accused of worldwide state-sponsored terrorism for Hezbollah and Hamas. The list of bombings and assassination attempts also speak for themselves. The 2012 Bangkok bombing and the Buenos Aires Amir bombing were both against Jewish citizens. Iran also finds itself in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia. It ranges from Africa to all over the Middle East. Iran is definitely a force to be reckoned with. The Iran war for Iraq was a daring adventure, because from a historical perspective, it was extremely dangerous to invade a country with 4x the resources and roughly the same technological progress. There were not many instances where the underdog came out victorious. Saddam's original plan, that Iranians would overthrow the Ayatollah, was a blatant miscalculation and backfired more than he could have imagined. Saddam, and by extension Iraq, fell out of favor with a lot of Gulf states and internationally. The loss of reputation and the crippling debt pushed Saddam over the edge. After his friends, who benefited from arms deals and contributed to the meat grinder, suddenly refused any help in rebuilding Iraq, which is what he assumed, it eventually sealed his fate. The first Gulf War came around, then Saddam was used as a scapegoat for Bush.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours.
And 20 years down the road, Iraq is largely considered a failed state, in which ethnic tensions threaten to destroy even the last bit of stability. On an international level, it is merely a playground in the great global chess game. Alright guys, if you made it until here, then I hope you enjoyed my little history lesson. This conflict was pretty messy, so I tried to give you an overview over the most important events of our time. Also, this project is the result of months and months of restructuring the channel. I hope it worked out. That's it for today. Let me know what you think about it in the comments, and I hope to see you next time.